Hello, welcome to my video, and with this video I'm beginning the series of Magnus Carlsen from Candidates 2013, and I shall begin with the round 1 against Levon Aronian. So as you can see, Levon was white and Magnus was black. And let's check out what happened in that game. So first we had something that's called Bogo Indian. Let me just check if, yeah, the board is okay. We had this order and now knight f3. And now Magnus has a choice to get to the Queen's Gambit declined with d5 and continue with either Ragozin or maybe even Vienna, dc4 and then e4, or just do this, but he chose to play in the Bogo spirit and he played bishop b4 first. Now bishop d2, trying to challenge this bishop, and with this move he's keeping an option of getting this knight from b1 to c3 at some moment. He doesn't want to commit with this move, which is also perfectly possible, I think. Perfectly possible. It's fine, I think, but the knight is not ideally placed on d2. So he goes for this, and here also black has several options like a5, c5. He might even go to e7 back, if I can recall correctly, and then go d5 maybe. But here Magnus plays capture on d2. Now queen takes. He takes with a queen, of course, because he is principled and he wants to get his knight to c3. And now Magnus starts the fight for the center by playing d5, and here we have some crossroads, because white has to decide where to develop his bishop. Does he want to go with e3 and get the bishop to d3, or does he want to play g3 to fianchetto the bishop and to play in more of the Catalan spirit? And he chose the second one. He chose to go knight c3, which usually means that white's gonna play e3. Usually when you play a move like knight c3, you decide not to develop by fianchettoing, because it's not really... When you fianchetto, you usually want to go queen c2, knight d2, and then to protect on c4. But with knight c3, you are saying to your opponent that you're going to pick up on c4 with the bishop, if some capture on c4 happens. Of course, also possible was to go g3, like I told before, and after castling bishop g2, bishop knight bd7, let's say, castle c6, and then to go rook c1, something like that. And the game would be a bit different from what we saw in the game, what we will see in the game. So after d5 he went for knight c3, and he's going to play e3 next. Now Magnus just castles and e3. Like I told before, g3 doesn't go well with knight on c3, because black might challenge white by taking on c4 and trying to hold on to this pawn. So this is more in the spirit of Queen's Gambit declined. And yeah, now black tries queen e7, trying to get rook d8, and then c5 prepares. Now rook c1 by white, and now rook d8. Trying to spook this queen out, to spook it out on d2, and then to prepare c5. And that's why white goes to c2. Tries to keep this queen out of d-file, out of some potential pin. Also here it was possible to go for the Carlsbad structure, just capturing on d5, and after this to go bishop d3. which I think is perfectly fine. I don't see anything wrong with this. Then white has some typical plans in this structure. Let's say if black plays c6, you can castle, and then try something like b4, b5, some minority attack, or even just to prepare e4. Yeah, you have lots of arrows here, but I think you should recognize the plans. So yeah, here if you try b4, black can stop it by a6, but then white can continue with a4 and then get his b5 in. But of course, black can also play b5 to block all of this, but it makes c6 a weakness, and both sides have to see their pluses, and it's nothing decisive yet, but it's a very complex position. Let's say if black plays knight e4, you can just step aside, and on bishop f5, then to go b4 with b5 next. Because if you take on b4, that's just leading to losing the e4 pawn, and eventually it's just some pressure on the b file. And I think that here central pawns are much more useful than the flank pawns on the queen side. So let's say if you here play a6 and now I play a4, what can you do? You can do knight d7, just ignore this, and now b5 is not as good, I would say, because after this you can take, and then take on c3. Now the issue is that you cannot capture like this because of rook a3 and losing the bishop. So white would have to go bishop f5, but then the b5 pawn hangs, and white doesn't have much prospects on the queen side. He can take on h7, but after king h8, black might even get some counterplay, even though he has less pawns on the king side. After g6, king g7, rook h8, and putting some pressure on the king side. So b5 doesn't work immediately, but what works? Well, you can do bishop e4, but even after this knight b6 will come, and black might organize some counterattack by this rook lift, rook d6, rook h6, and white always has to worry about the potential sacrifice on h3 if you play h3 yourself. So the play is pretty much alive, and you cannot really rely on one thing such as minority attack or such stuff. You always have to look after some counter attack on the king side by black. It's not very simple as it might seem at the first glance. So let's go back to the game. Let's not get too far. Here queen c2 was played, stepping aside, and now Magnus plays a6, a semi-waiting move, but also it prepares dc4. Also, the thing I forgot to mention here is that black is simply waiting for white to get his bishop to either e2 or d3, and then to capture on c4. That's a very typical strategy in this position, in these types of positions, because you don't want to develop his bishop in one tempo when you take on c4. You would like for white to spend one tempo on bishop e2 or bishop d3, and then to capture on c4. And that's what Magnus does in this position. Prepares a6, b5, a6, dc4, b5. And Levon plays a3. He's also waiting. He doesn't want to play bishop d3 because of the before mentioned dc4 and b5 with bishop b7, which would resolve the issue of the bishop on c8, which is at the moment quite passive. And let's go back here. Uh, does white have any other move? If he plays c5, then black has knight c6. Preparing e5 and getting this bishop out. And now a6 becomes more and more useful, because if there's no a6, you can argue that bishop b5 is a possibility, and just to eliminate the knight on c6, get knight e5 and have a blocked center. But with a6 played, e5 is becoming a real possibility on the next move, and white cannot stop it. So he can go bishop e2, but e5 comes and the bishop is getting out. And yeah, this is a typical source of counterplay when somebody blocks the center, to just try to undermine this center. The second thing that can be used against c5 is b6, but it's more useful when the pawn is not on a6, when it's on a7, because b6 in this case could be slightly problematic, because you can take and you have a better version of Slav, because the bishop on c8 is still a bit problematic in this position, and you have some control over c-file, and I don't think it's going to be pleasant for black in this particular case. But if you imagine that the pawn is on a7, in case of capturing, well, then you can take with the a pawn and make the position much more imbalanced. Then push c5 and break this center. But okay, Levon played a3. So we looked at a move c5. Also here, a move like this was possible as well. Again, this Queen's Gambit exchange-like position. And after black captures, oh no, too many captures, bishop d3 can be played, and now there's an interesting situation, which doesn't usually happen. And what I mean by that is that black can play knight c6, which usually doesn't happen, because you want to put your pawn on c6, knight on d7, f8, and so on. But in this particular case, with the queen on c2 and the bishop on d3, and the king being uncastled, which is even more important, this move is quite useful, because if you try a3, there is bishop g4. And now, because of the pressure on the d4 pawn, you must allow capture on f3. You must allow doubling the pawns on f3. And you cannot move the knight from f3 because knight d4 comes because of the pin. So what do? You can castle, but then white structure on the king side becomes quite vulnerable, and now we see the same plan, rook d6. And black might even go at some point rook h6 when the knight moves from f6. So this could be very interesting to see. But Levon played a3, knight bd7, still waiting for things to happen, and now Levon plays a slightly inaccurate move, I think, bishop e2. I think this was the time to change structure with cd5 and play this position with the Carlsbad structure, and go bishop d3, and now knight c6 is would not be useful. So yeah, knight d7 is slightly clumsier. And what now? You can go c5 as black, trying to change structure even more, but I think c6 is more useful, more solid, let's say. And in case of castling, to go knight f8. A typical maneuver for this situation, just over defending the h7 pawn and getting the bishop out at some point. And now white has two options. I mean, at least two options, and one of them is b4, just getting the good old minority attack, and the second option is knight a4. The point of this move is not to make any weaknesses and such, but to just fix the queenside. And the idea behind this is next. If black goes knight g6, to go knight c5, and let's just put some random moves on the board. If black doesn't do anything, king h8, b4, let's say rook g8, a4, rook d8, and then a5. Fixing these pawns with these three pawns, or two pawns and the knight, and then trying to prepare e4 break. That's the whole point. But I wonder if black has something better, because black might have some counter chance on the king side by rook d6, let's say, and such moves. So it's not like black is going to let white to do whatever he wants. He also has legitimate chance to get some counterplay. But Levon played here bishop e2, which was the signal to capture on c4 for Magnus. Takes, and now c5 first. But the point of this move is very simple. You want to eliminate white's center as soon as possible, not to allow any b4 moves to stop c5 and to make black's pieces much more passive. So by c5 you just want to exchange a c pawn for the central d pawn. And now Levon goes back, b5, and now we have some exchange. And now queen takes. Probably he didn't like knight c5 because, well, I don't know really why. Maybe because the knight belongs to b6 later on and then on c4. But tactically speaking, I think there's nothing wrong, because if you take on b5 now, ab, if you take, black has b4. And the a pawn hangs in the end. You cannot capture on b4 because there's rook a1 and white is just lost. So this would probably go too simple. Like, simplify the position too much. And maybe Magnus tried to test Levon in this type of position. He didn't want to simplify that early, but you can see that the structure is very symmetrical. There's no room for some crazy attack. But with this move, at least nothing is decided yet. Now Levon plays b4, tries to gain some space on the queen side, and prepares maybe at some point to go a4 and to break the queenside pawns if he needs. Magnus goes to e7, and now finally white castles after 16 moves. And now the last piece is introduced, the bishop on b7, and we can say that now we reached the middle game. I don't know where is the limit of where is the border between opening and middle game, but I would say that when all the pieces are out, at least all the light pieces are out, then you can say that the opening is over. And I think that this is an equal position because there are no visible weaknesses for both sides. Both sides are developed normally. I would give slight advantage to black because his bishop is a bit more intimidating than the bishop on e2 when you compare these two pieces. But this knight on f3 is a hero, so you cannot really say that it's such a dangerous position for white. And now the move that Levon played really simplifies things, simplifies even more. And here he plays a4, trying to hit this pawn on b5. And with this move, we'll see at least one pawn exchange. But probably if you take on a4 right now, then a6 might become an issue, and maybe that's why Black didn't want to take like this, because probably after queen a4, the b4 pawn becomes more defended, and maybe in the future a6 becomes a bigger target. So here Magnus chose to take on b4, securing himself on the queen side. And now Levon plays ab, and now queen b1. Even more disgusting exchanges. What to do now? Black can go back to e7, but will this make any change? I don't think so. I don't think so. So he took on b1, but I wonder what would happen if, let's say, queen e7 would be played. Let's say go back. Maybe it's just some unnecessary pressure on the B and C file. Maybe just knight b5 or with rook c7 next. Maybe he didn't like that, but I think it's also okay for Black. This position is okay. I think that he saw that he doesn't have any serious chances to win this, and he just chose not to risk too much by capturing like this. And after this, he even took on f3, bishop f3, rook a b8, and we saw a couple of more moves, a couple of more exchanges, to be more precise. Knight d4 now to stop doubling the f pawns. And now we have this, rook b1, h6. And now we're at move 25, so this means that they had to make 5 more moves. So they did that. And after a couple of more moves, rook c2 was played, and they agreed to a draw, which is pretty much understandable. There's not much to be played for, and that's how it finished in a draw after 31 moves. So this was game 1, and what's interesting about this tournament was that Carlsen was playing against the Soviet school, quote-unquote. In the candidates there were Kramnik, Aronian, Gelfand, Grishuk, Svidler, and did I forget any? And Ivanchuk, yeah. So all from the Soviet Union, from the former Soviet Union, against Magnus, and this was quite funny. At least to me, I don't know. Maybe it's not funny, but to me it is. Okay, let's go to the game 2. Just give me a second to write it down. The second game was between Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik. Carlsen. I think he was the number 2, Kramnik, at the moment, or Levon. Levon and Kramnik were in top 3. Carlsen was number 1 by far. And one of the favorites to win the whole thing, for sure. round 2, and let's just... Okay, this is the board, and in the round 2, well, you can say that I think that Kramnik also drew the first game. I think he actually had 7 draws in first 7 games, which was giddy-like. And in the second round, these two players met, and we had the English. c4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and now d4 early on. Now, of course, black doesn't want to allow d5 with some much worse version of Benoni with e6, let's say, and just allowing too much in the center. Losing tempi in Benoni is not really good for black, so black has to capture and go knight f6. So now white just continues developing by knight c3. And now e6. Also there is g6 or d6, but I chose this one. I think this option is much more solid than g6 Marozzi bind with this, yeah. And black has white has several options here. He has g3 as an option. I think even e4 at this point. Kramnik variation in the Sicilian. But here Magnus plays bishop f4. And what is the idea behind this move? Well, he wants to get knight db5 at some point. For example, if you just ignore this and go bishop e7, you might want to reconsider your options by after this move and targeting the d6 square. And if black plays d6, well, then you might still transpose to the previously mentioned line after bishop e7, knight db5. Black has e5 at least, and after bishop g5 to go d6 with some Sveshnikov-like position when white has d5 outpost, and black tries somehow to generate counterplay around this weakness. So Kramnik doesn't want Sveshnikov-like positions, and he plays d5. It's more in the spirit of Vaganian gambit, which appears after c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, d4, this e5, and now d5. After which you don't capture on d5 because of some fork on c7, but you just play a6, I suppose, and then when it goes back, just bishop c5, and then black is leading in development, but has a pawn less. But I think I'm gonna do a video on that opening especially. So let's go back here. So d5, and now e3. Just defending the pawn on c4 and trying to develop. Also, there is an interesting move here, interesting variation. This move. After which you want to go knight c7. You cannot defend by bishop. So the only way to stop this is to go e5. And then there is some semi-forced line after cd5. Then black captures on f4, takes on c6, takes. We have the queen exchange, and after this, king c7. I feel like this can be anyone's game because Black is structurally pathetic, but also has a bishop pair. C6 is weak. Pawn structure of black in general is quite pathetic. So these types of positions are quite interesting because you never know which factors will overweigh. Will this be dynamic game or just some static stuff in which weaknesses will be very, very crucial? But Magnus chose not to involve himself into this one, and he played e3, much calmer variation, and Kramnik just decides to finish developing by bishop b4, and now bishop e2. White does the same. And now black took on c4. You can see that, like in the previous case, black waited for white to play bishop e2 and then captured on c4, which feels really natural when you think about it, when you know the point of this. The point is to make white lose one move, and it's very logical. So this c4 was played, and now Magnus decides to simplify the game by capturing on c6, and this leads to queen exchange. What else was his option? Well, he could have taken on c4, but I think that he didn't want to lose time on such a move. And also, black has an option of capturing and going knight d5, which I feel like is not too much for white. White has IQP, but somehow it fails without the knight on e5, which is usually the feature that white wants in such positions. Without this knight on e5, it's not the same position. It's much easier for black to defend, because there's no pressure on f7, which in some cases additionally makes black's position unpleasant. But in this case, with one pair of pieces gone, and even potentially the second pair, because the knight on c3 is potentially gone, I think that black is the one who has pleasant game. But in general, it should be equalish, I would say. But Magnus tries to enter this simplification and tries to play for some small advantage. Knight c6 was played, and then black took, rook takes, and now bc. And only now white takes on c4. At the moment, white has a slightly better structure because of these grandpa's teeth. But black can also make grandpa's teeth by bishop takes c3 and balance this structure. So first black goes knight d5, which is quite clever because you want to challenge the bishop and this pawn, this knight on c3. You don't have time for bishop e5 to defend this knight, because there's f6, and after bishop d4 there's e5 as well. And what have you done? Well, you lost your bishop. So no, you cannot do that. So that's why Magnus castled. And now it's a question, can you take on c3? Bishop c3 looks very scary because giving up this dark square bishop looks a bit pushing it too much, you know? Because once the bishop gets to d6, the king is not feeling so safe. Even without the queens on the board, I'm not a big fan of this. So capturing like this, takes. I think it's also okay for black, but he has to give up this pawn on c6. Maybe just something like rook d6 will equalize, and let's say this, If you go bishop b7, I have rook b1, and what are you doing? I don't really know. You cannot go rook b8 because of rook c6 and losing some material for sure. So I think after rook d6 you have to just say goodbye to the pawn on c6 and maybe just castle, get the king to safety, and get on with your game, because if you try to hold on to this pawn, it's not gonna bring too much happiness to black. If you play c5, you might want to consider your options by after bishop b5 and then bishop c6 even. So I think that Kramnik did a good thing, not being too greedy, and he took on f4 actually. ef, and now he could have held on to this bishop pair, but having slightly trickier position because of this weakness on c6, you know. And he just chose to give up this advantage of the bishop pair, but in return he damaged the white's pawn structure as well. After this he went king e7, just trying to connect his rooks and also stopping some rook d6. And very soon we saw this fizzling out to a draw, petering out, whatever. Bishop d7, rook b7, and now rook hb8. Now the rook is challenged, so you have to go and support it, but after this, now the only issue for black is that the rook on b7 is a bit unpleasant, and you want to kick it out very soon. But if you go immediately king d8, king c8, white has an answer by bishop a6, and this is not the way to go. Not really a way to go, and the move Kramnik played was the move I like so much. I think the most precise move in this game, and the move he played was a5. Now, what's the point of this move? Well, now you want to go king d8, king c8, and white doesn't have bishop a6. So there's not much that that white can do. He just went bishop d3, h6 first, h4, trying to just I don't know what, maybe just to stop g5, but in general it's useful to make such moves to get more space. And now king d8 by black. King d8, trying to kick this rook away, king c8, rook b8, rook b1, and now finally black neutralizes the pressure, and he goes rook b8. And yeah, now after bishop a6 you can go king c7, and bishop on a6 is not doing much, so Carlsen just took on b8, king b8, and even in this game, after move 23, we have an equal endgame, and they just are trying to get to move 30, and after a couple of more moves, after c5, king e3, well, if you go king c4 here, you can just go king c6, and you got to be careful a bit not to get some checkmate like e5, fe, bishop e6, but you always have some bishop e4, but always be careful. So he went back to e3, bishop c6, g3, f6, just putting all the pawns on the light squares, dark squares, sorry, a3, and now after e5, takes. It's simply a draw because these kings cannot approach each other's position, and it's simply a mutual fortress. And after this move, move 30, they just agreed to a draw. So we are 40 minutes in, and every single game was a a very quick draw, but with some very useful tips, I think, at least. So the next game is round 3. Boris Gelfand against Carlsen. Whoops. Okay, now the game 3. Gelfand was white and he chose 1d4. Just let me check if the board is okay. The board is okay. Alright, and Magnus doesn't change too much. He plays knight f6. Gelfand continues with c4, e6, and now knight f3. And again we see 1d5. Well, not again, because bishop b4 was played in the previous. Right? Yeah. So d5 is here, and we have the queen's gambit. Knight c3, and now knight bd7. And bishop g5, typical queen's gambit move, c6, e3, and now we have the Cambridge Springs variation, queen a5. After which Gelfand plays cd5, which I think is the main move here. There's also a move like knight d2, but there's bishop b4, let's say queen c2, and after castling bishop b2 and c5, I think that black does quite fine here. After he gets c5, although in 2 moves, I think it's okay for black. But Gelfand plays in this position cd5. And now Magnus takes with the knight. Because if you take with the pawn, that's not really in the spirit of this whole variation. Queen on a5 doesn't do much with this Carlsbad structure. And the point was to capture with the knight. To challenge this knight on c3 immediately. Go bishop b4 next. And also, if you try something like this, knight e4, trying to challenge the bishop and the knight on c3, well, now white has intermezzo with d4, d6, d4, fe6, and just go bishop h4. And if bishop b4, let's say, to just keep pressure on c3, you can go queen c1. And now you can just go like this and exchange queens, but this whole situation with central pawns and plus the e6 pawn is weak. I think that black wants to keep queens on the board. Plus bishop pair as well. That's a bummer. So if black tries to go here with the idea of just taking the exchange by bishop c3, well, white has a very elegant solution here to play a3. And now if you move the bishop, I take the knight. If you move the knight, I take the bishop, and we have something similar, but still I have the bishop pair, so it's not very useful to black. And yeah, if you go here, I take it, queen b4, and I think I can go knight d2, but I can also go king d1. And claim that you don't have enough power to use my king, because I can go bishop d3 next, king e2, rook d1, and do some artificial castle in the next couple of moves, and in the long run my bishop pair is going to pay off. So that's all about these sidelines, and Magnus chose knight d5 instead. And here Gelfand played rook c1. Here queen d2 is played also very often. And after bishop b4, to just go rook c1. It's also very important here not to neglect the bishop, to move the knight, let's say, to d2 or something like that, because when you take on c3, take bishop on g5 hangs in some variations. So let's say h6 can be played here, but you can go back and then go b6, but after this, I don't know how smart it is to take on a3, because white has a very good compensation for this this pawn, because he'll go at e4, bishop d3, and have a full center. So black has to be a bit careful in this position. And what happened in the game was that after this, rook c1 was played, and we got to something similar to the game. Now if you try this, you might try to sacrifice a pawn. After this, queen a3, queen d2, e4 comes next, or bishop d3 with castling, and black has some issues with space, plus development is quite dubious. So Magnus just tries not to involve himself into too much trouble. He took on c3, bc, and now bishop a3. Again, he doesn't want to involve himself with pawn grabbing, because then white just develops and has much easier play. He is fully developing, let's say bishop d6, castling. Let's just evacuate the queen to a5 and then d8, but after c4, it feels like black is going to suffer a lot. It looks that way. So he chose not to go for this, which would just squeeze his space, and also with some central control, it also doesn't feel that good. So he chose to just develop with tempo, bishop a3, rook c2, and now b6. Now with b6, he's trying to liquidate the light square bishop. Bishop d3 was played, bishop a6. And also I think that if white didn't play bishop d3, if he just didn't move the bishop, that black would not play bishop a6. And we have the same point as in previous two games. Black is waiting for white to develop his bishop, and then offers a trade. So let's say if you play h3, I doubt that black would play bishop a6 immediately. I think that he would maybe castle and then wait for bishop e2 or bishop d3. But Gelfand played immediately bishop d3 and now bishop a6. And now you can play bishop e4 to avoid this trade, but it's questionable. Is it worth avoiding exchange when you cannot castle? You cannot castle really, so maybe it's just best to get over it and just castle. They exchanged and now Magnus castled. And now, how to continue for white? How to continue from white side? Gelfand played e4, which seems very logical, just trying to occupy more space in the center and then eventually developing some attack on the king side. Also, what's interesting here was a move like c4. And the point is to meet c5 with the move d5. Also, c5 in this case doesn't feel like the brightest move because with c5 you're blocking the bishop from a3. I think you need to get the bishop out to f8, let's say, before you push c5. So I think that after c4 you have some options. Also, the idea is to somehow squeeze the queen side to stop black from playing b5. And let's say if you play h6, let's say bishop f4, rook a d8, queen b3, just to get this queen from the pin. Now the queen on a5 is a bit stranded, and if you decide to go to get the bishop back to e7, now you might fix these pawns on the king's on the queen side by a4, and the queen has to find a way out, maybe even to f5 or h5. But the queen side seems a bit suspicious. But okay, I think e4 is also a good move. Magnus played rook f8 and now e5, which is very committal. And the reason why I think it's so committal is that after black's pawn push c5, he's going to weaken the d5 square for white. If you imagine a push c5 takes, now the d5 will be under some pressure, and I think that white should stay flexible here with these two pawns and just play something like bishop f4, fighting for this square on e5. Also, now to play c4 is not really good because after d5, after e5, d5, knight c5, black gets some nice play because he gets the c5 square for his knight. In return, white gets a passer, but I think it's far from something palpable, and I think that black is doing just fine. So he chose this, trying to get more space to limit this knight on d7, but in the long run I think that the d5 will become a much bigger issue for white, and now the only way to play for white is to play dynamically, because positionally, statically, he's doing much worse than black. Black's structure is much more compact, and we'll see what happened next. So first black plays h6, and now bishop h4. Maybe here you can just stay on this diagonal, just hinting at some possibility of the sacrifice on h6. But he went this way, and now black goes c5, undermining the center and trying to get some counter chance on the queen side. Knight b2, I think that d5 here is just simply bad because of c4. And then after this, you can take ed5 and put enough pressure on the e5 pawn, and you might even just play queen d5 and exchange queens if you wish. And I think that black doesn't have any chances, any problems in that case. So he chose this. Now black took on d4, took, and now rook ac8. And now it becomes more obvious. We have some glimpses of what's gonna happen in the future. And what's gonna happen is that black is trying to get his knight to d5 at some point. Maybe something like b5 and knight b6. And white is trying to generate some play on the king side by pushing the f pawn, trying to open up the king side, f4, f5, capture on e6, or just pushing f6, and something like that. Those are the blueprints of the play, what both sides want. Black wants to plant his knight to d5 to assert dominance in the position, and white wants to play more dynamically and tries to basically checkmate black's king. And now white goes knight c4, and now you might think that it's over because the bishop is under attack twice, but luckily there is this move. Now you don't go to a6 because queen takes a3 loses on spot, because the queen is loose. So you just go queen b5. Well, he goes queen b5, and now if you take on a3, there's this, and after takes, you can take on a7, but he takes on d4, and e5 becomes very loose. So after queen b5, there was a very interesting option here for white, and it was queen b3. But after this exchange and going bishop b4, rook fc1, let's say, to just avoid something like b5, you can go for g5, bishop g3, and I still don't like white's position because d4 is a glaring hole in the position. White has to be really careful to maintain this position. So white chose to go more dynamically and chose f4. A very simple idea, just going for f5 next and trying to open up the king side. But now Magnus just says, okay, I'm just gonna semi-ignore this and try to put my pieces on the right place. But actually this move is a loss of time. And it's not supposed to be necessarily a bad thing, because white also did something really nice, and also something really exposing to his king. So it's not very clear what is it. And only now white took on a3. And he could have gone with f5, just being more principled in this case, but after this, now the knight is under lots of pressure, and you can take on e6, take on a3, and now there is e6, which is a bit weaker than you would like. But even in that case, rook c4, queen c4 takes, queen d4, bishop f2, let's say, queen d5, bishop b6. I think this is supposed to be a draw. But I'm still not sure, because black is going to pick up a2 pawn, and e5 is much weaker than e6 because it can be attacked 3 times while the e6 pawn can be attacked twice. But still, I could not be so certain about this position. After queen c7, rook a2. I would still say that black is pleasant to play here. But also with only 2 pawns on the king side, the black's king can also be in some small danger. But I would give black advantage here, of course. So f5, as interesting as it sounds, as it looks, is also a bit sketchy. So Gelfand took on a3, and now we have this forced sequence, and first bishop f2. Defense first. Defend on d4. Because if you take on a7, there is queen d4 and king h1. Knight's gonna come to c5 at some moment, or just go queen d5 first. Why not? Rook a8 comes next, and it seems like the a pawn is going to drop any moment. So Gelfand chose because of that to go bishop f2, and now queen c7. Also here, instead of this move, it was interesting to give up this pawn on a7. Just go for rook c8, and if you take on a7, just go queen d5. And the plan is the following: b5, knight b6, knight c4, and when you get the knight on c4, you become more and more optimistic. You get more chances to trick your opponent, and it becomes more and more unpleasant for white to play. Even though he's a pawn up, that extra pawn is this pawn, which is, God bless him, very useless. So bishop f2 was played, queen c7 to just defend the pawn, and now rook c1 first. Queen b7, and the c-file is currently under white's control, and that's what makes Gelfand play this move. Queen d6, trying to get rook c7 in, but there was a very weird move that was possible in this position, and the move is queen f3, which at first seems like a lunatic move. Why do you want to double the f pawns when you have also the d4 pawn, which is quite weak? But on the second glance, if you exchange queens like this, gf, now the c7 becomes all of a sudden available to white's rook, and it's not so easy to meet this. If knight f8, rook c7, if knight g6, well, first you can go f5 and after this to take it, and still it's around equal, but black also has to be very careful about the d pawn, and also the b6 pawn is not the easiest to guard. So this is a very interesting moment to go queen f3, double the pawns, and still have some good chances in the game. The second move that's very interesting, well, it can be seen as a transposition. It's f5, and in case of capturing, to go queen f3. Whoops, queen f3, and I think that queen a6 is not good for some reason, but I think it's queen c6. Queen c6, and what do you do? If you go rook d8, I go here and you're over. So I think that black has to somehow, to exchange queens and get over it. If you go here, then I can at least take on f5 and maybe put some pressure on f7, why not? So if you do f5 takes queen f3, I think the best is to take it and do something like this, but it's supposed to be equal as previous things. But Gelfand played queen d6, and now what happens is that first Magnus plays knight f8. Rook c7, well, that's not really the brightest move because of this. And now the f4 is under some pressure. Of course, the rook is still quite shaky, but I think once you get knight g6 in and some h5, h4, you know, I think it's gonna be easier for black to both defend and attack at the same time. And Gelfand played preemptively g3. Also, what's interesting here was a move d5, just giving up this pawn. If e5, let's say, then you can go rook d1 and then try f5 and e6. If you take with the queen, well, then you take and go rook d7, rook c7, and then I think that black has enough activity for this pawn. Knight e6, let's say, rook a7, knight f4, bishop b6, and the material gets very much reduced. Plus, the a pawn is a bit annoying here. If you do this, well, you can push the pawn or just give a check and push the pawn. I think that there are lots of play. There's lots of play. So Gelfand plays this, and now Magnus plays rook c8. The reason why he doesn't play rook c8 immediately, well, if we go a move back, if he goes rook c8 here, and then there is this danger after a move like g3 to stop queen c1, and now you cannot go really knight f8 because he untangles after d5. And if you try queen b7, then queen e7 is a bit unpleasant and it's not easy to untangle for black. Because you always have to worry about some check on e8. Let's say if you go here, there is queen e8 and you're losing the f7 pawn because you cannot play this because the queen hangs. And that's why he first played knight f8, and after g3 he plays this. Well, it can be the same, I think. It is the same, I think, yeah. Well, if you go here, and then g3, it could have transposed, actually. Because what happened was, in the game, what happened was after knight f8, d5 was played. And it transposes to the game. So here, g3 was played, rook c8 takes, and now Gelfand chose to just exchange this bad pawn for the opponent's pawn, which makes the outpost on d5, and after capturing queen d5, g6 first, trying to stop f5 and further expansion, king g2, and now knight e6. And now we have this endgame in which Black has better chances. And the reason why, well, he has the extra pawn on the queen side, which usually is suitable to one side. The reason why the queenside extra pawn is more useful is that it's easier to push the pawns where you don't have a king. You might first argue that, okay, but I have an extra pawn on the king side. But yeah, if you push the pawn, it makes your king much more vulnerable. So that's basically the reason why it's better to have the extra pawn on the queen side. You just have easier time to push these pawns on the queen side, where you don't have to worry about the king safety and such stuff. So queen f3 was played by Gelfand, and first Magnus does Magnus things, and he plays king g7, just improves the position step by step. I don't know how much is needed to play king g7, but we'll see. a3 by Gelfand, and now h5. The point is just to slow down these pawns, if necessary, and also to push h4 to make this whole pawn chain a bit unstable. And that's why Gelfand plays h4. Which seems very illogical, very, very bad. As a very bad move. But also you don't want to allow h4, h3. And you might have something like g4 in the future and opening up the king side. So you always have to weigh the things you do. Do you want to allow h4, or do you want to make your pawns impotent by doing this? So Magnus continues with queen c2, tries to control the f5 square. And also he's trying to get his b5 or a6 b5 move. And now Gelfand tries to counter this by queen b7. Now queen a4, and this forces white to go back to f3 to defend the a3 pawn. And now it's time to push the pawn, to push b5. And this was a signal to begin something on the king side, because you cannot do much about it on the queen side. Black is going to push his pawns, and you don't have enough resources to stop this. So this is the signal to start something on the king side to harass the king. And this is what Gelfand does. He plays f5, tries to break the king side pawns. And yeah, he gets some counterplay against Black's king. So Black took, queen f5, and now Magnus takes on a3. But Gelfand is also going to capture some pawns. And the king is much unsafer, and now it's very interesting, because if the bishop gets more active and the h pawn also runs, it might turn out ugly for Black. But Black doesn't care, he plays a5. And now Gelfand gives a check, king h8, and now Gelfand plays h5. Which was apparently a mistake on a move 40. In this position, the best move was queen h5, actually. The point of this move is to get check on h8, check on f6, and use this fact that f7 pawn is weak. So in case of queen c3, you give a check, give one more check, give a check, king d7, and again queen f6. And because of this glaring hole on f7, you cannot go knight d8 because of this. So black has to give some check maybe on c6. But then king g1, and black is asking, white is asking black, how is this going to continue? If you go knight d8, then e6 is very, very nice. And if queen takes, just queen g5. And now the h-pawn is quite strong. And black also might have to bail out with some exchange, let's say 2 pawns on the queen side for the h-pawn, you know? And I would be a bit scared to be black here, because the h-pawn might just be a decisive factor in this case. So maybe it's just the best to bail out with perpetual, just to allow, after this, just to allow king f8 or king e8 and just go into this perpetual mechanism of attacking the f7 and defending and back and forth, you know. But yeah, you have to be careful about the h-pawn as well. So that was the best way to go for white. And he went for h5, which is also quite understandable, because you want to push the pawn and somehow to deflect black's forces from defending or pushing the queenside pawns. You want somehow to trade h-pawn for 2 pawns on the queenside, in the best case. Well, in the best case you promote, but it's never gonna happen. But now Magnus plays queen c1, and the queen is quite stuck. The queen doesn't have good squares now, and that was the point of queen h5, to just include the queen and get something dangerous. But now after queen c1, queen has to waste some time on other moves, and it goes to e4. But now black has time to push the pawn. It plays b4. And yeah, now you don't have time to pick up a5, because in the meanwhile you just go b3, b2, and it's just game over. So Gelfand just introduces the bishop into the play. Bishop e3, and now queen c7. Now I think that bishop h6 is not doing much, because you can go king g8, I suppose. And because of this monster knight on e6, you're defending against queen g7 checkmate. Let's say this, you have to move the bishop, because there's no checkmate on g7, and the bishop goes back. You lose the pawn, or just push the pawn to b3, and it just doesn't feel like black has any issues. Maybe he has issues because of queen f5 check, possibly, but you can take on e5. So let's say, what happens if bishop f4? Well, in that case, I think you can go queen c2 first, just stopping this check, and then pushing the pawn to b3. So Gelfand chose the other way. He chose to give a check, king g7, and now h6. It seems a bit scary in terms of getting perpetual, not checkmate per se, but I think scary in not winning the game. Now Magnus plays king h7, and now queen e4 check. King g8. Queen a8, and now queen d8. Stopping any more checks. And now I think that Gelfand does make a huge mistake, which is decisive in this game. He exchanges queens, which is not really understandable. I don't really get why he did that. He took on d8, and he hoped that he could hold this advantage, this position with black having 2 passers on the queen side. I don't really understand this decision. What was best here was to go queen c6. And to try somehow to hold these pawns. I don't think that pushing the b pawn is anything scary, because there's queen b5 and the b pawn is just lost. Unless you have a4, but I don't think so. You can just take it and maybe give some checks. Queen g4 next. So I think this was the best try, and after queen c7, you just give a check. Give a check. Go here, give a check. Queen d8. Even a queen b7 now. And let's say queen g8. To go here and stop these two pawns. And I don't see a clear way to proceed here for black, to somehow break through, you know? I don't know, this could be the way to hold it. Although black has something like queen g6 here, and giving up one of the pawns is not very tragic. Because after this, queen c2 comes, b3 next, and you hold all the checks on this diagonal, so it's very useful to have that. But at least it feels more resilient than what happened in the game. After queen d8, just to go queen c6 or queen b7 as well looks much more resilient, and even this move with h7 idea. But there is this move which stops h7. The idea of h7 is to deflect the king from defending f7, and by doing this you should go king f2 maybe, but there is b3, and even if you do h7, the sad part for white is that after this there is knight g7, and the knight covers all the squares, all the checks. So in the game, Gelfand chose to exchange queens, which is puzzling to me, but maybe he thought that it was anyways hopeless. Now he tries to get his king closer, but now the a-pawn runs, and after king e4, knight c6, bishop c1, now knight a5. Improving the knight, bishop d2, and now b3. Now the knight is off the limits, I would say, or what's the expression? Because if you take it, the b-pawn just runs too fast. So the king has to get closer, but now knight c4 is quite nice. And again, the knight is off limits because of this, and there's no stopping this pawn. So white goes bishop c3, but now the a-pawn just runs. Those pawns are just synchronized so well. White plays g4, and now the final touch, king h7, g5, and king g6. Just having fun with his position. Bishop d4, and now b2. After which Gelfand plays king c2, but Magnus plays a very nice move, knight d2, and now at least white is going to lose a bishop, because he has to stop b1 queen. And the only way to do it is to sacrifice on b2, but that's not gonna stop black, because he's gonna capture on g5, capture on h6, and that's basically game over. And that's why after knight e2, white resigned. And this was the first win of Magnus Carlsen in the candidates 2013, and yeah, that's how he got to 2 points out of 3. And in the next round he played Alexander Grishchuk, but about that I'm gonna talk tomorrow, in tomorrow's video. So I hope you learned something new today about some small tips, tricks. That's it. See you soon, guys, and take care. Bye.